When options multiply, why more choice can feel less free. You open a menu with 50 nearly identical choices, and instead of feeling empowered, you feel your attention drain before you've even eaten. You scroll through options you didn't ask for, plans, settings, upgrades, bundles, and by the time you decide, you're not sure you chose so much as surrendered. This is a quiet friction many people recognize. More choice arrives dressed as freedom, yet often lands as weight. And the stakes are not trivial, because the way we structure choice shapes agency, dignity, and how responsibility is distributed across a system. More choice often feels less free because abundance shifts the burden of sense-making onto individuals, while systems optimize for engagement and throughput, turning choice into a transfer of labor and risk. In this sermon, I will not claim that choice is bad, or that fewer options automatically makes life better. I will not offer a neat method for always choosing well, and I will not pretend that every constraint is humane. I will try to clarify why the experience of choice changes under conditions of scale, why good intentions can still produce harm, and how to name the hidden costs that ride along with unlimited options, so we can see where agency is strengthened, where it is eroded, and who pays when we call burden freedom. We need a few terms in plain language, because choice is not one thing. First, choice as a moment versus agency as a condition. A choice is a discrete selection. This plan, that product, this path, that message. Agency is the lived capacity to make meaningful selections without coercion, with understanding, and with a reasonable ability to bear consequences. You can have many choices and low agency if you don't understand the options, if the costs are hidden, or if the consequences fall on you alone. Second, abundance. Abundance is not just a lot. It is a situation where options exceed what attention can process. In abundance, the limiting resource is not availability. It is time, comprehension, and the ability to compare. Two kinds of abundance feel very different. One is abundant because there are genuinely different paths aligned with different values. The other is abundant because the same thing has been sliced into dozens of slightly different forms, each demanding evaluation. The first can expand life. The second can exhaust it. Third, decision fatigue. This is the ordinary depletion that comes from repeated evaluation and self-control. It is not a moral failure. It is what happens when a human mind is asked to repeatedly do what it does slowly, weigh trade-offs, forecast outcomes, and hold uncertainty. A day full of micro-choices, what to click, what to accept, what to compare, can leave you less able to decide about what actually matters to you. Sometimes called an externality. A hidden cost is a consequence of a choice that is real, but is not carried in the price tag, the interface, or the narrative. It might be paid by your future self in time, by another person in labor, or by someone you never see. The key point: hidden costs don't disappear, they relocate. Now, an assumption. Humans are finite. Attention is finite, time is finite, patience is finite, and clarity is finite. Systems that present unlimited options are often designed as if these limits are inconveniences rather than constraints. Another assumption: intent is not impact. A product designer, a platform, a service, or a policy can sincerely intend to give people more choice, and the impact can still be to increase confusion, anxiety, and unequal burden. When we separate intent from impact, we can be honest without cynicism. We can say, this was offered as empowerment, and also say, this functioned as pressure. We also need to name what freedom means in this conversation. Freedom is not simply the absence of a barrier. Freedom includes the ability to understand what you're agreeing to, the ability to refuse without penalty, and the ability to act without being overwhelmed by complexity. Freedom includes consent that is informed and not coerced by design. Ordinary examples make this concrete. Consider a phone plan with 5 tiers, each with footnotes, bundling, and limited time conditions. The buyer is told they have choice, but the structure is designed so that only a specialist can confidently compare. Or consider a workplace tool with dozens of settings that must be configured before it becomes usable. The choice exists, but the labor of making it workable has been transferred onto the user. So when we ask, why does more choice often feel less free? We are really asking, when does choice expand agency? And when does it function as a burden, an unpaid job of evaluating, managing risk, and absorbing uncertainty? There's also a moral vocabulary that sometimes sneaks in here. Words like lazy, indecisive, picky, ungrateful. I want to set that aside. If abundance creates exhaustion, that does not necessarily reveal weakness in the individual. It may reveal a system optimized for offering options without carrying the cost of helping humans choose. One more grounding distinction: variety versus meaningful difference. Variety means many items. Meaningful difference means that those items represent distinct values, outcomes, or trade-offs that matter. When systems flood us with variety without meaningful difference, they are not expanding freedom. They are consuming attention. And attention matters here because attention is where agency lives. If your attention is fragmented, your choices can become reactive. If your attention is captured, your choices can become performative. Choices made to satisfy the system's prompts rather than your own priorities. Finally, let's name consent. Consent is not merely clicking accept. Consent is the capacity to understand what is being asked, to refuse, and to renegotiate without punishment. In many modern choice environments, consent becomes a ritual that legitimizes complexity. The user agrees, therefore the system is absolved. But agreement under cognitive overload is not the same as consent. With these terms in place: choice, agency, abundance, decision fatigue, hidden cost, consent, we can examine the tension. Why choice can be sold as dignity while functioning as extraction of attention and transfer of responsibility. Choice becomes heavy when it is produced at scale without care. That sentence contains a tension worth sitting with: scale versus care. Scale is the ability to serve many people efficiently, to distribute a service widely, to replicate an experience. It can widen access, but scale also tempts systems to treat humans as interchangeable units: users, customers, accounts, because variability is expensive. Care, by contrast, is attention to context: what this person needs, what they understand, what they can carry, what they did not consent to carry. When a system scales, it often reduces the cost of producing options. Digital systems can generate infinite permutations: more filters, more categories, more settings, more recommendations, more personalization. But the cost of evaluating those options does not scale the same way. The human cost is paid one mind at a time. That is the first paradox. A system can make options cheap to produce while making decisions expensive to make. Now, add optimization and incentives. Systems do not simply offer choices. They arrange choices to achieve outcomes. Sometimes the outcome is reasonable: reduce confusion, increase satisfaction, help people find what fits. But often, the measurable outcome becomes the true north: clicks, time spent, conversion, retention, engagement. These are not evil metrics. They are partial metrics. And when a partial metric becomes the goal, it begins to reshape what choice means. Here is how good intention turns into harm. The intent is give people what they want. The impact becomes keep people interacting. The system then learns, through testing, through feedback loops, that more options, more novelty, and more constant prompts can increase measurable activity. It also learns that discomfort and uncertainty can be leveraged. Are you sure? You might miss out. Others chose this: limited availability. Even without overt manipulation, the architecture of abundance can pressure the nervous system. So the second tension: automation versus agency. Automated recommendation can help people discover what fits without exhaustive searching. But recommendation can also narrow attention into a corridor shaped by the system's incentives. When the system chooses what you see, your choice is constrained upstream. We're selecting among options curated for a purpose that may not be yours. This is not a claim that personalization is always wrong. It is a claim that curation is power. The question is, who wields that power, toward what ends, and with what accountability? Now the third tension: metrics versus dignity. Dignity is the recognition that a person is not merely a means to an end. Metrics, by their nature, treat people as data points. That doesn't automatically violate dignity, but it creates constant risk. What is easiest to measure begins to stand in for what matters. The system starts to reward what can be counted and neglect what cannot. In choice environments, what can be counted is selection, speed, and frequency. What cannot easily be counted is comprehension, regret, coercion, and the quiet costs that show up later: time spent troubleshooting, the stress of uncertainty, the erosion of trust. Let's name two failure modes explicitly: one at the individual level and one at the system level. Individual level failure mode, self-blame and paralysis. When confronted with abundant options, a person can internalize the burden. If I choose wrong, it's my fault. If I'm unhappy, it proves I chose badly. If I'm overwhelmed, it proves I'm incompetent. This can lead to over-researching, chronic comparison, and avoidance. The person becomes stuck not because they lack character, but because the environment has turned choosing into risk management without adequate information. System-level failure mode. The system presents a maze of options and then claims neutrality. You had choice. That phrase becomes a shield. It shifts responsibility for outcomes onto the individual, while the system continues to shape the field of options, the defaults, the framing, and the friction. If a user ends up with a bad outcome, the system can say they selected it, even if the selection was nudged, obscured, or coerced by complexity. Defaults are a particularly revealing mechanism here. A default is a choice that is pre-made unless you opt out. Defaults are not neutral. They express the system's priorities. They can protect people from complexity, or they can funnel people toward what benefits the provider. When a default is designed for the system's gain, the choice to opt out can require time, literacy, and stamina many people do not have. This is where access enters the conversation. Abundance often assumes a baseline capacity, time to read, comfort with forms, fluency in the language of comparison, stable internet, a quiet place to decide, and the confidence to ask questions. People with more resources can treat abundance as opportunity. People with fewer resources can experience it as a tax. The same menu can be empowerment for one and exclusion for another. Consider a hidden cost and an excluded stakeholder. Imagine a service that offers unlimited customer choices through an interface, endless configurations, bundles, and add-ons. The consumer's hidden cost is hours of evaluation and later troubleshooting. But there is also an excluded stakeholder, the support worker who absorbs the confusion created upstream. When choices proliferate without clarity, someone must handle the mismatch between promise and reality. Often that someone is lower status labor, tasked with apologizing for complexity they did not create. The system calls this support. The worker experiences it as volume, time pressure, and emotional labor. The customer experiences it as frustration. The designers and executives experience it as metrics. In other words, unlimited options can function like a factory that manufactures misunderstandings, and then hires someone else to clean them up. Another paradox, abundance can reduce commitment. When it is easy to switch, it can be hard to invest. If everything is reversible, nothing is chosen deeply. This is not about romance with scarcity. It is about the meaning-making function of selection. Some choices are not simply preferences. They are declarations of what we will live with. When choice becomes endless, the system trains us to keep a foot out the door. But we should also be careful. Constraints can be oppressive. The problem is not constraint itself. It is whether constraints are transparent, consented to, and oriented toward dignity. A locked door is different from a guardrail. A guardrail acknowledges risk and protects agency. A locked door removes agency without negotiation. So the question becomes sharper. What kinds of constraints make agency possible? What kinds of options erode it? And how do incentives push systems to offer the latter while advertising the former? One reason this persists is that the harms of abundance are diffuse and delayed. The benefit is immediate. Look at all we offer. The harm shows up later. Regret, exhaustion, wasted time, and a creeping sense that your life is a series of micro-selections made under pressure. Systems tend to optimize for immediate, measurable wins, not for long-term, hard-to-measure human steadiness. This is why the experience of freedom can degrade even as the number of options increases. Freedom is not the quantity of doors. Freedom is the ability to walk through one door without being punished for not walking through 10 others at the same time. And in an environment of constant choice, the mind begins to scan for the missed option, the better deal, the hidden feature, the alternative self that could have existed if you had picked differently. Abundance can turn imagination into dissatisfaction, not because imagination is bad, but because the system keeps it agitated, never letting it rest. A system that scales must also account. That is the constraint abundance tries to evade, the accounting of human attention, human comprehension, and human consequence. When choice becomes an unmanaged abundance, the consequences are not only personal, they ripple outward into relationships, workplaces, and institutions start with the individual experience without pathologizing it. Under constant options, a person can feel chronically behind. Not behind in achievement, but behind in evaluation. The sense that you should have researched more, compared more, optimized more. Life becomes a sequence of auditions, each decision an opportunity to prove you are a rational chooser. This pressure can erode dignity because it implies that worth is measured by optimization. One second-order effect is the shrinking of trust. Trust is what allows a person to act without exhaustive verification. In high-choice environments, trust can feel naive. If there are always hidden fees, changing terms, and fine print, the rational posture becomes suspicion. Suspicion consumes attention. Attention consumption reduces capacity for care in other areas. The system may call it consumer vigilance. In human terms, it can feel like living in a state of low-grade negotiation with everything. Another second-order effect is the privatization of risk. When systems say you chose, they also imply you accepted the consequences. But many consequences are not legible at the moment of choice. The long-term cost of a contract, the interoperability of a tool, the future lock-in, the future price changes, the future difficulty of exiting. If those are obscured, the choice is not fully informed, yet the risk is still assigned to the chooser. This leads to a subtle redistribution. Institutions move from being responsible for outcomes to being responsible for offering options. We provided choices becomes a substitute for we ensured fairness and clarity. In that swap, the labor of due diligence is transferred from the provider to the individual. In workplaces, abundance can show up as process overload. Many tools, many channels, many settings, many ways to do it. The stated intent is flexibility. The impact can be fragmentation. When each person chooses their own toolset, coordination becomes harder. Then the organization adds more systems to manage the complexity. The result is a paradoxical tightening, more options followed by more oversight, because the system must regain predictability. There is also a relational consequence. When choice is framed as personal sovereignty, it's all up to you, people can become less practiced at shared decision-making. Shared decision-making is slower. It requires listening, compromise, and the willingness to accept good enough for the sake of alignment. High-choice environments can train people to expect perfect personalization. When they encounter other humans who cannot be perfectly personalized, frustration can rise. The system teaches a kind of consumer posture toward relationships. If it doesn't fit, swap it. Again, this is not a claim that people are shallow. It is a claim that environments teach habits. Attention shapes behavior, identity, and outcome. Now consider inequality. Abundance is often navigable for those with time, education, and support. For others, it becomes an access barrier. Forms that require literacy, interfaces that require fast reading, comparison tables that assume familiarity, these are constraints. If a system requires sophisticated interpretation to avoid harm, it is not equally accessible. A concrete hidden stakeholder appears here, the family member or friend who becomes an informal navigator. When choices are complex, medical forms, school options, insurance tiers, digital security settings, someone often does unpaid translation. That labor is invisible in the system's accounting. The platform celebrates self-service. The household experiences it as one person carrying the cognitive load for everyone else. Another second-order effect, the erosion of accountability through diffusion. When outcomes are bad, each actor can point elsewhere. The interface says, "We disclosed." The provider says, "The user chose." The user says, "I didn't understand." The support worker says, "I don't control policy." Responsibility is distributed, but it becomes dissolved. And when responsibility dissolves, harms persist because no one is structurally required to repair them. There is also a consequence for meaning. Some choices are identity shaping. How you spend time, what you commit to, what you learn, what you keep. If every domain becomes a marketplace of endless options, identity can start to feel like a product configuration. You are prompted to constantly refine yourself, upgrade, optimize, curate. The self becomes a project managed by dashboards. This can feel like freedom at first, I can be anything, and then feel like pressure, I must keep up with every possibility. This pressure is not just internal, it is reinforced by systems that reward display. When selection is visible, what you chose, what you bought, what you subscribed to, choices become signals. Then choosing becomes performance. Performance makes choice less free because it is shaped by imagined judgment. A further second-order effect is environmental, without turning it into fear. Unlimited options often mean unlimited production. More variants, more packaging, more shipping, more returns, more waste. The consumer sees a smooth interface. The externality appears elsewhere, in logistics, in discarded goods, in energy usage, in labor conditions. Even if the system does not intend harm, the pattern can produce harm. And here we meet an uncomfortable truth about abundance. It can be profitable to create dissatisfaction. A satisfied person stops searching. A person at rest stops clicking. If revenue depends on continued engagement, the system has an incentive to keep desire slightly unfulfilled. Through conspiracy, but through ordinary optimization, the system learns which states produce continued activity. This is why the problem is persistent. It is not just a psychological quirk. It is an incentive alignment problem. The costs of abundance are borne by users, households, and workers, while the benefits, data, engagement, sales accrue to the system. One might ask, why don't people simply stop? That question misses the constraint. Many choice environments are not optional. They are the entry point to services, work, education, health, social belonging. When abundance becomes the default mode of interaction, opting out can mean exclusion, so the freedom to refuse is unevenly distributed. We should also acknowledge that sometimes the more choice is real and humane, more accessible products, more diverse representation, more pathways for people historically excluded. These are genuine expansions of agency. The point is not to romanticize old limitations. The point is to separate meaningful plurality from manipulative proliferation, and to notice what the system ignores. Systems that celebrate unlimited choice often ignore the cost of attention, the cost of coordination, and the cost of regret. They ignore the support labor that catches failures. They ignore the unequal capacity to navigate complexity. They ignore the dignity impact of constant evaluation. When those costs are ignored, they do not vanish. They become background stress, interpersonal friction, and a subtle narrowing of what freedom feels like. The person has options, but not spaciousness. The person has access, but not clarity. The person has autonomy in theory, but not agency in practice. So where does that leave us, if we are not trying to land on a clean conclusion? It leaves us with better questions, and with a practice of seeing. One question is, which choices are truly mine, and which are choices I'm being asked to manage on behalf of someone else's incentives? Not as accusation, but as clarity. There are choices that express values. There are choices that express a system's desire to offload cost. Another question, what information is missing at the moment I'm asked to choose? When the future costs are hidden, the choice is not fully consented to. We can notice the gap, without expecting ourselves to magically fill it. Another question, who benefits from my continued comparison? Who bears the cost of my confusion? This is where dignity meets accounting. If an environment is designed so that many people are confused, then confusion is not an accident. It is a tolerated byproduct. And tolerated byproducts are a kind of value statement. We can also hold the tension that some constraints are protective. A limited menu can respect attention. A clear default can protect people from unnecessary burden. A standardized process can make coordination possible. Yet constraints can also be used to control and extract. The moral quality is not in more or less, but in whether the arrangement supports agency with informed consent, and whether it acknowledges who carries the cost. When we say freedom, we might mean the thrill of possibilities, but we might also mean the steadiness of a life that is not constantly up for bid. Freedom can include the ability to stop evaluating. It can include the right to be ordinary, to choose once, and to live. This is not an invitation to blame ourselves for being tired of choices. Tiredness is information. It tells us that a system is demanding more attention than a human can sustainably give. And when a system demands what humans cannot sustainably give, it will predictably produce harm, confusion, inequality, and the quiet erosion of meaning. It may help to remember that no system is neutral. Every system encodes values. A choice architecture that privileges speed and volume encodes one set of values. A choice architecture that privileges clarity and consent encodes another. And each architecture shapes the kind of person it expects you to be. If we can name anything as a shared reflection, it is this: the experience of freedom depends on the quality of attention available to us. Attention is not just a private resource, it is a commons constantly pressured by design. When attention is continuously harvested, freedom becomes a slogan rather than a felt reality. So we sit with the unresolved question: what would it mean for our tools, our institutions, and our everyday interfaces to treat attention as precious, and to treat clarity as a form of respect? Not as a demand, not as a program, as a way of evaluating what we are offered. And we can leave room for the fact that sometimes we will still choose poorly, or quickly, or under pressure. That does not prove we are defective. It proves we are human in an environment that often refuses to be humane. What we can carry forward is not a solution, but a lens to notice where choice expands agency, where choice transfers responsibility without support, and where someone invisible is paying for the appearance of endless freedom.